I'll start you with a quote. Police leadership in the 21st century means understanding why we kneel and helping us rise. That quote used to be on the walls of Wrighton Police College, where we train the most senior leaders in policing. And I know it was there in 2020 because I wrote it. It's not there now. And I'd like you to consider why when you listen to this. Now, does everyone here know what a TED Talk is? Very intelligent people. So does anyone know why there is a reason why no ideal TED Talk is more than 18 minutes long? Anyone know? Right, 18 minutes is basically the longest period of time a human being of average intelligence can concentrate for. You're not average though, are you? Because you wouldn't be here at university, I hope, if you were average. So you should be able to speak and listen and then ask me lots of difficult questions because you're not average. In fact, it's me who shouldn't be here. Unlike my predecessor as the National Head of Counterterrorism, Sir Mark Rowley, a successful Cambridge mathematics graduate, and my successor, Matt Jutes, a successful Oxford University graduate, I was an Oxbridge reject. Thank you, Wolfson College. The only way I could get into this building was because I was AXO, as Kenny said, Assistant Commissioner, Specialist Operations. And since I retired, Cambridge have very kindly made me an affiliated lecturer to one of your faculties. But I'm not an academic. That faculty of criminology and social science calls me a participant observer. I'm happy with that. It has also published some of my opinions, and that's all they are. They are opinions. I hope you enjoy it. More than that, I hope it makes you think and debate what is a critical issue of our time. And it's a 5-part story based on my lived experience called Race, Policing and Me. I know that's a bit narcissistic, I'm sorry. Wait till the book comes out in April next year. It is about the need for inclusive leadership in the 21st century. And although it's specifically about policing, I've been asked to deliver this in lots of organisations. The only profession that doesn't ask me to come back and regularly speak on this issue is policing. Think how that makes me feel. I know words like lived experience, anti-racism, woke, white privilege, and institutional racism cause an immediate defensive, sometimes hostile reaction inside. This is a bit of a trigger word. We've just had an entire government, the previous administration, that constructed a cultural war out of those issues. And identity politics is very unpopular and it is often destructive. It certainly cost me. I'm afraid I do use some of those terms, largely to make you think, but please be open-minded. It is my opinion, as I've said, after all. You can be very blunt in your feedback. I am not easily intimidated. Now, 10 years ago, I was easily intimidated, and that was by public speaking. 30, I normally like a podium where you can't see my knees knocking together. But I guess 30 years as a cop, 7 of those in counter-terrorism mean pretty much not intimidated by anything anymore other than overhead lighting. Very obvious reasons. And this was because at a televised press conference many years ago, I made the beginner's error. Well, I made 3 errors. The first was I had my phone with me. If you have on television, everyone you know will check whether you switched it off. Second mistake, I had not switched it off. Third is I looked down at the inevitable text being pinged, and it was from Joshua, who's my youngest son. They said, "Dad, step away from the light. You're beginning to look like a giant talking Malteser." Thanks, Josh. Now, this talk was designed. I originally started delivering this after the murder of George Floyd. And it was our desperate lack of diversity of appearance and thought that triggered it. But it is actually based on a leadership talk I used to give nearly 15 years ago. And a lot of it hasn't changed for obvious reasons, because I was still the boy that I am today 15 years ago. And I always worry how it will adapt for a different audience, but maybe you can tell me afterwards. My last operational job, Kenny was describing, not specifically accurate, because although I was the head of counterterrorism for the Met, if you're head of counterterrorism for the Met, you are head of counterterrorism for the United Kingdom. So it is quite a job. It's called Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations. The acronym is AXO. I stepped down from that job on July the 4th, 2021, which I described as my very own Independence Day. And when I retired in November 22, I was the highest ranking officer of colour in the United Kingdom. I had been for about a decade. I'm the 4th person of colour to reach that rank since 1829. In the Met, I was race and faith champion. It is the most diverse force in the most diverse city in the world. Nevertheless, I am not an expert in diversity. People have PhDs in this subject, some of them may be in this room, but I am an expert in me. So I talk about my experience of racism, policing and prejudice, and what I think needs to be done about it. And I talk about race because that's what I know most about, but it is about prejudice. I hope you can see how this might apply to you, even the people you work with or who work for you and your own organizations. So, part one, the context of why I'm here. When I applied to be a police officer in 1991, the Met was less than 1% of colour. It's now around 17%. That sounds good. It's a very long way off the 46% non-white population of London in the last census. So it needs to do some different things. And many Londoners, and particularly the Caribbean community, still consider policing institutionally racist, and they are using Sir William McPherson's definition of 1999. And that was also the conclusion of his damning report into the Met's failed investigation into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. I know a great deal about that investigation. At one point, I was in charge of the re-investigation. Many just consider all police officers individually racist. And that does set up the ambiguity of that case, which my friend, the current commissioner, decided to call political, ambiguous, and unhelpful. We do not agree on this. Every commissioner has avoided using that phrase since Lord Condon grudgingly used it in 1999. Why? And that is a key question. And I don't think Mark Rowley's explanation cuts it. I think I know why he went there, though. Some communities have less trust and confidence in police and the whole of the state. They carry scars from decades of suppression, over-policing, and under-protection. Policing has a disturbing legacy of racist and corrupt policing, and the communities affected want police to do 4 basic things: acknowledge that, say sorry, admit it's still a problem, and change. I think chiefs are ignoring those requests for the sake of their front line. It's how they might react to a label that chiefs have never sought to explain, not even back in 1999. And quite simply, Suella Braverman would never have given Mark the job, or she would have taken it away in a heartbeat had he admitted it. Now, society's attitude to prejudice is way better than when I joined up, but it's hardly perfect. And the latest damning indictment of policing was Dame Louise Casey's, Baroness, I should say, sorry, Louise. Baroness Louise Casey's report into the Met in 2023. Pretty recent, isn't it? That report was commissioned by Mayor Sadiq Khan after the collapse of confidence caused by the horrendous Met police officer Wayne Couzens murdering Sarah Everard, the ill-judged policing of her vigil, the serial Met police rapist David Carrick, and a whole series of professional standards cases that involved discrimination of all kinds that were happening in very recent times. Add to that the 7,000 members of the Met's own staff, officers and staff, who complained to Louise. I was one of them. For the first time in the history of measuring public consent for policing, less than 50% of the Black community had confidence in it. Wider public confidence fell by 20 points. That is a disaster when you police by the consent of the public, not by the use of force. And it wasn't just about racism. Louise's report was about all prejudice. Policing lost trust and confidence from Black women, but also women and girls and the gay community. I would argue it's never had the confidence of people with disabilities. When you add up those groups, you get the majority of the public, and that is a big problem. Policing found it much easier to admit and react to the low confidence of women and girls than it did to ethnic minority, gay or disabled communities. Again, ask yourself, why would that be the case? My opinion is it's because we all know a woman or a girl in our lives, probably one we like. And that gives us a natural point of empathy for women and their lived experiences at the hands of men. Even if those men who don't respect women and girls will actually know them. How many people of colour, gay people or disabled people do you know? And if you do, how well do you know them? And if you know them well, do you ever talk to them about the prejudice they suffer? In 2021, it took just 3 months for a National Police Chiefs Council, that's the 52 most important officers in the country, to launch a fully funded unit under a dedicated Deputy Chief Constable, who produced and launched a national action plan to combat violence against women and girls. That was the correct response, the right thing to do, and at the correct speed. The Race Action Plan, which was commissioned after the George Floyd protests took place in May 2020, took 2 years to launch. It was half-baked, crucially failed to acknowledge the key issue on which it was founded, the need to address institutional racism, not just individual racists. And it took a lot less time to be sidelined by successive Home Secretaries and therefore by the majority of Chief Constables, the College of Policing, and Her Majesty's Inspector of the Constabulary. Because if the government doesn't care, then why would a police chief constable? What does policing want? Does it really want representation in all of its ranks, of all the people it serves, and the trust and confidence of all the communities? Or do chiefs want to avoid admitting anything that will annoy certain politicians or upset some of their front line? Because they certainly will upset people if they say it, and the few who have definitely did. You're looking at one. I think chiefs are very happy with the status quo. No one likes change. It's hard work to change. It's very hard work to win trust and confidence back from the public that you have let down. Some chiefs argue these community critics are the minority who never wanted to help us anyway, and so this approach is both counterproductive and a wasted effort. But as I said, if they bothered to add up all of those minority groups who are complaining, they would quickly realise they are actually the majority, a disaster for consent-based policing. But before policing acts, when it has launched its race action plan, it should really be asking itself what outcomes it actually wants. I worry chiefs ask themselves that question and answered it by deciding they don't care much about the trust and confidence of marginalised people, or representation in their ranks, or disproportionality in the way that they act. What they really care about is low crime figures and keeping politicians on side. Publicly, they said they wanted representation and the trust and confidence of all, as indeed did the government, who at the same time undermined that with the language it used and the culture war it started. 2 of the last 3 Tory Home Secretaries welcomed the Casey report findings, called for more trust and confidence in policing, and yet at exactly the same time, they championed anti-wokeness, political incorrectness, a call for training on diversity, equality, and inclusion to stop, and just to add to that, they demonised immigrants. All from behind female brown faces who were daughters of immigrants, which I found extraordinary. They went on to support chiefs who continued to refuse to accept Casey's underpinning and catastrophic conclusion that we were institutionally prejudiced, while still trying to maintain that they were fully accepting the report. Now, Louise Casey is a good friend of mine. Ask her if she thinks they fully accepted her report. Braverman also called for cops who were strong in character and physique rather than intellect. So she undermined our attempts to professionalise the police as well. Good grief, why would you do that? As I said, if governments don't care about diversity or professionalism, why should chiefs? And so the National Police Chiefs Council, the college, and the new commissioner all fell into line. Why were politicians doing that? Do you think they are happier with senior police officers who might be seen rather than heard? I think so. I actually know so. In 2021, I directed the most senior course in UK police leadership, and I ran it on the basis of the delegates understanding politics, prejudice, and their role in police legitimacy. If you wanted to be a chief officer in 2022, you had to pass my course. And during that course, I addressed Chiefs Council to try and make the case for finally accepting institutional racism so we could launch the National Action Plan and move on. I was voted down. That taught me quite a lot about the policy direction of UK policing, and it made my decision to retire later that a year's time much, much easier. So, why did you join Basu and why did you stay? Given the heavy introduction, you might precisely wonder that, and how I lasted for 30 years in this profession and how I got to be the head of counter-terrorism. So here's the short version of that story. As AXO, the Assistant Commissioner in charge of counter-terrorism and protective security in London, as I said, you are the national lead for counter-terrorism. So you are matrix managing 8 other regional counter-terrorism units and the partnership with PSNI and Police Scotland. I figured you're not a proper detective until you get into counter-terrorism. But I couldn't break in, even as I became one of the most experienced detectives in London. In fact, I waited 23 years until I was promoted to Deputy Assistant Commissioner. That was a big day. I came home, I excitedly told my family. Joshua, he of the Malteser jokes, looks at me and says, "Dad, deputy and assistant in one job title." Don't, you used to be a commander like James Bond. That was really cool. I was quite upset. So for those who don't know, there is one commissioner in London, the most senior job in the country for policing. There's one deputy commissioner. There are 4 assistant commissioners and just 7 deputy assistant commissioners. So I was part of the admittedly unlucky 13 senior leaders who run the 45,000 people of the UK's biggest force by a country mile. And I thought, God, that's quite cool, in the top 13. My wife, the great Dr. Nina Cope, an ex-lecturer from this university, who never misses an opportunity, said, "Neil, you should probably also remember that you are now a deputy assistant to an assistant to a deputy." So this says quite a lot about how hierarchical the Met is, but also my place in my family. Now, in 2018, Mark Rowley retires. He goes off to become a knight and climb Everest, and I'm chosen to replace him as exit. Josh is the first person round to my house and says, "Dad," I just Googled that, "National Head of Counter-Terrorism, that's fantastic. This time it's cool." He's now so big, I'm looking up at him, and he gives me a massive hug and he lopes off to the gym to get even bigger. How many here are parents? I'm going to ask you a simple question. Would you not want to win the respect and admiration of your youngest child? I'm not embarrassed by this at all. He left me in floods of tears on my doorstep. And then my phone picked, and I looked down through the tears, and it's a message from Joshua, and it says, "Still an assistant." That's Detective Constable Joshua Basu these days. I am so proud of that. But there is a real point here. I say this not just because I'm incredibly proud of my funny family, I am, but because every senior leader needs somebody who keeps their feet on the ground. I used to say to every chief constable, "Remember you were a police constable once." The most important thing for senior leaders is humility. I got it wrong many times, and you need to know when you're right. UK policing does not know it's wrong on this debate about diversity. It has lost its humility in this space. Whilst I had to settle for being an assistant, AXO is one hell of a job. I led a £1 billion budget and about 10,000 staff. In my 7 years, I responded to 12 terrorist attacks and disrupted 29 plots. The UK threat level came down, and I was very proud of that. With MI5, I briefed the Home Secretary every week. In fact, I briefed 4 Home Secretaries, 5 Security Ministers and 2 Prime Ministers. I sat on the National Security Council. I was one of the highest paid public servants and one of law enforcement's loudest voices, sitting on the Home Secretary's National Policing Board. I don't say this because I'm arrogant. Remember my point about humility. I say this because I don't want you to feel sorry for me after this talk. I do not feel sorry for myself. I have no axe to grind. I had the best job, particularly for a career detective, and the highest rank. I loved it. You cannot call me a victim because I am not a victim. I don't think of myself as a victim, and later on you might want to describe me as a survivor. I came a long way, not by constantly looking backwards at what had happened to me in my past, but learning from it and looking forwards. And if you're trying to find out where to go, or you are constantly looking behind you, you are going to stumble. I wish that was my quote. It's actually the Indian ambassador. But in the end, I did stumble. I may have taken that final step up until the time I started to speak about diversity, until I told truth to power. And I want you to reflect on that and understand that I'm standing here for everyone who looks like me or has any protected characteristic that has none of the power or platform I had in order to speak that truth to power. And what problems do I face now? Very few in reality, but perhaps just 3. The first is making people understand the importance of this time. The second is trying to develop empathy for people who look like me. And the third is persuading people that it is time to act. So I'm going to tell you how I got there and why I think inclusive leadership is important, whether you like it or not, or trapped in this room. I normally put a slide up of my mum and dad at this point. I don't like using slides, but I like seeing my mum and dad. I'm mixed race. I was born to a 1961 immigrant dad from Calcutta and a white Welsh mother from a remote village in North Wales. I was raised in a very small white town and went to two almost all-white schools before I was 5 years old. My early memories are feeling alone in the playground, and I watched my father suffer a racist assault as he was hit through his open driver's window. I was strapped into the car seat behind him. My primary school teacher told me that if anyone treated me badly for being different, I should see him. And I know he was trying to be kind, but I didn't know I was different because I was 5. When I was racially abused by older kids, my mother explained to me that it wasn't my fault, it was theirs. And that must have been very hard for a white mother of a 7-year-old Indian kid. On my first day at high school, I was beaten and stuffed into a locker. I still remember the smell of the locker. And yes, I remember all 3 boys' names. I really hope they remember mine. For years, I took that abuse. Of the 1,200 kids at my school, the other one of colour was my older brother. And we never talked about it. On my mother's 80th birthday, we talked about school for the first time with our little brother. The little one was 50. I was 54, Kuma was 56. I thought they'd got off easy at school, but I was very wrong about that. And 50 years is a very long time to keep that bottled up. My mother was listening, and she cried, wondering if she had done the right thing by marrying an Indian and having mixed-race children in the 60s. She loved my dad unreservedly and unconditionally for over 50 years. It was unbearably sad to hear her say that. And I was born in 1968, the year after the National Front was born, whose favourite chant was "There ain't no track in the Union Jack." In August 2024, you may have heard EDL and Tommy Robinson supporters screaming "Whose streets? Our streets," while wrapped in the Union Jack or St. George, flags the far right in this country have co-opted. I preferred watching the Olympics and Team GB at the same time, the most diverse of sporting sides, celebrating their medals wrapped in those same flags. That's what Great Britain meant to me. But on the other channel, I was transported straight back to my childhood. I was born just a few weeks before Enoch Powell made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech that changed all of our lives. By the late 70s and 80s, casual racism was everywhere. It was on the street, in the classroom, and on television. My best friend's favourite expressions were, "But you're not like them," whoever they were, and "play the white man." And playing the white man was a matter of survival in 1970s England, let me tell you. So by the mid-1980s, I'm built like a brick shithouse. I'm a successful sports captain. I've got the highest grades in school, although my teacher reports still describe me as average, strangely enough. I've never been average at anything. I didn't get bullied anymore. I had a succession of white girlfriends. One told me how her family couldn't stand to be touched by Indian doctors, and she told me that while she was holding my hand. My dad was an Indian doctor. I wasn't chippy, angry, or militant about this, just painfully shy. Remember, I'd kept what happened to me to myself for nearly 50 years. I went to university. I made friends with mostly white public school boys. Several were casually racist. Some of them still are. On graduation, I joined a bank involved in apartheid, and I witnessed corruption and greed. I resigned to join the police and applied just after a BBC documentary called Black in Blue. And that was about the hopes and dreams of young Black and Asian police recruits to the Met. If you can still get it on YouTube, don't bother watching it. It's not very uplifting. My friends thought policing was entirely racist and corrupt, which was ironic because that's exactly what I thought of the bank I was working for, but they were still horrified I was joining. My father didn't want me to join either, but 23 years later, he took that secret to the grave with him, along with the massive pride of what I had actually done. According to my mum, he thought I was going to land the first person who was racist to me and end up in prison rather than the policing. And having quit the bank, I still had to wait 18 months to join the Met, so I became a salesman to pay my rent. That company thought I would be really useful at selling stuff to Asian shopkeepers. But after 6 interviews, they still hadn't asked me where I was from or whether I spoke any Indian languages. I speak more Welsh than Indian, and that's exactly one word, which is Clanfawr Pwlwingri. Now, there's normally somebody Welsh in the audience who absolutely exposes me for the charlatan I am. My grandmother told me that, God rest her soul. I'm not trying. I'm sorry about my pronunciation. I did tell you I was a really bad linguist. I always get taken out by the properly Welsh person in the room. I'm proud of both being Welsh and Indian, but wasn't raised with either culture. But this company didn't care, never asked me a single question. I had 6 interviews with 6 different directors, and they still gave me a job. Not one question. People don't talk about the problems of mixed race much. I was always uncomfortable in rooms full of white people and equally uncomfortable in rooms full of Indians. I grew up knowing how it felt to be different from everyone in the room because I felt different everywhere. I know how hard it is to speak up and be heard when you're different. You don't want to say something stupid. You don't want to say something wrong. I was taught to be twice as good to get noticed and never ever fail, because there would be no second chance for people who looked like me. That is a terrible lesson that parents still give their children today. And I don't blame them, because it's still true. I was competitive. I learned this lesson, and I learned how to win. And that meant fitting in and working so hard, I left nothing for family and friends. That is a very unjust consequence of being told that this is the only way to succeed. And it is a byproduct of working in a prejudiced society. All of this gave me a very profound sense of imposter syndrome. Now, that syndrome wasn't even identified until 1978, let alone talked about. And then it was about women, not people of colour. They also hadn't yet identified that 70% of people suffer from imposter syndrome. You were not alone. I always wonder what the other 30% are suffering from. Entitlement syndrome, probably. Or are they just sociopaths that a few of those? So what changed me then? Age, experience, good coaching and mentorship, the development of real resilience. All of those things help. And for me, that resilience didn't come from family, friends, or fitness. And it doesn't come from faith, because I'm not a religious man, though I think these 4 F's are incredibly important. I'm slightly jealous of you with faith. But for me, real resilience came from focus. It came from an understanding of my purpose, understanding what your mission is. It is said there are 2 important moments in your life, the day you are born and the day you find out why. I found out why when I became a cop. And my resilience came from that sense of mission and my values. I knew my purpose, why I was there, what my values were, and what I wanted to do. And it's why I stayed in a profession that didn't always act like it wanted people like me. And when I joined the job in the early 90s, society was very different. Still racist, but much more subtle, much more underground. At training school in 93, the commandant wanted an officer of colour for that year's graduate recruiting brochure. And there was little choice. The black man, the Indian woman, and the turban-wearing Sikh were unacceptable to him. I know that because my instructor was in the room when he said it and was told to go and ask me. And when she did, she said she'd never speak to me again if I agreed to do it as the token darky. Her name was Sergeant Frida Holdens, the first Asian female sergeant in the Metropolitan Police. She knew quite a lot about racism and glass ceilings. I did it. I asked myself why ever since. Ego may have had something to do with it, possibly. But I did think that if someone who looked at me sees that photo and joins up, it's worth it. It's important to have thick skin if you have dark skin. But in the next 5 years, only 3 officers of colour, including me, had been hired out of some 400 fast-track entrants. And that's not exactly a successful campaign, but it was my earliest attempt at diversity leadership. And I had no rank and no power. And it's a lovely photo. My mother still has it. In the station, some of my black and brown colleagues were taking other colleagues' abuse. If they weren't being overtly abused, then I noticed they were always considered crap at their job. But I was a very hard target. I was 6 foot, 16 stone. You had to be pretty ballsy if you wanted to abuse me to my face. And perhaps most importantly, I was very good at the job. Watts, a much older, experienced and well-regarded colleague, called a boy a black bastard in front of him. And he turned and he saw my face like thunder and he immediately apologized. But to me, not to the boy. To add insult to injury, we all suffered more abuse from the public than we ever got from our colleagues. And I got used to the public always turning to the white officer, even as I became the most senior officer on the scene. I got used to being stopped by my police colleagues as I drove through London off duty. I probably shouldn't have bought a gold second-hand BMW. It was mint though. I didn't know my colleagues called those cars black man's wheels. I did know it meant black man walking, because that was an 80s hangover from the Sussex stop and search that sparked the Brixton riots. And I was serving in Brixton while I was being stopped by my own colleagues. But now it was the late 1990s. I got used to not getting served at the bar or walking to pubs on a late turn to calls of, "Are you my taxi driver?" If you look like me when people are rude to you, you think it's because of your colour. They could just be rude, but I am never 100% sure. And I've got hundreds of stories like this. People who look like me, work with you or for you, have many more. And I bet they don't have my platform or my rank that I had as cover to push back. Your black and brown colleagues will often not want to speak truth to power because they know what happens when you do. You are ostracized, you are labeled troublemakers, and they are afraid of that. I tell you this because I wanted you to understand how it felt. Born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, coming of age in the 80s, and trying to get promoted in the 90s in a white society, in a white, straight, male majority profession. Ask yourself, having heard that, how psychologically safe you would feel telling the stories I just told you at work if you were different from everyone around you. The difference is, of course, not always as obvious as mine. After George Floyd was murdered, and after the global protests, many people spoke out, and unfortunately, they weren't all old dinosaurs like me. Part 3, what happened next? So I had something to do with people speaking out in the Metropolitan Police. My second piece of real diversity leadership, in my view, is a single blog that I broadcast internally on the 28th of May, 2020, 3 days after the murder. I had tried to lead before. I was a young sergeant on the Lawrence Inquiry team in '98, advising my bosses how to deal with the charge that we were institutionally racist. I wrote and said things that did end up in policy. I've been interviewed many times. I've given evidence to political inquiries. I've led 3 diversity boards in the Met. In 2012, I wrote a report about the Met for the commissioner of the day called the Diversity Health Check 20 Years After McPherson. I'll give you the conclusion. It wasn't very healthy. In fact, it said exactly the same things that were in Baroness Casey's report 10 years later. But it helped get me promoted, and then it was swiftly buried. Later on, I sat on Precedent's management board and her diversity board, and I had my say. I spoke out at Chiefs Council, and I sat on its race action plan board. But when you retire, it's common to feel you didn't do enough of something. And that's how I feel about this. I mean, what is the point of leadership if you don't do the difficult stuff? And let me tell you that catching gangsters and terrorists was much easier than this. So I wrote an internal blog 3 days after George Floyd's murder, and I wrote it to my white colleagues to help them understand how people like me might be feeling. It was widely read. In fact, it was the most read blog in Met's intranet history to that point. And then it was immediately leaked to the Daily Mail. Clearly not everyone liked it, including fellow officers of colour. Some felt patronised or exposed. Some didn't even know what I was talking about, which was brilliant. Some thought I was calling their white colleagues racist and stood up for them. Also brilliant. They asked why I wouldn't support their white colleagues when protesters were calling them racist. And they were being called race traitors by exactly the same protesters in the same breath, all while they stood there and took it, standing shoulder to shoulder, not black or white, but blue, the thin blue line. Again, utterly brilliant. Black officers defending white officers and vice versa, just like the mix in the protests themselves. And that was a sign to me of change and hope, an improvement in policing and society. But I didn't feel safe writing that blog as an assistant commissioner, and I would never have written it as a police constable. My views on racism eventually compromised my career. So be it. To be of value, perhaps it has to cost you something. Right-wing media described me as the super woke so-called head of counterterrorism. I still laugh at that. Better to stand by your values than be asleep, I thought. And I was really proud to be super woke by the proper definition of woke, though the so-called head of CT hurt. And it cost me. But if it cost me to help others speak out, people without my protection of age, experience, or rank, then it was worth it. And their stories were really hard to hear. They were really awkward and embarrassing. People collapsed, they were in tears, but you had to listen to them. And I wrote that blog because a white police officer killed a black man like an animal in 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And it didn't matter to me that it was thousands of miles away in a different police culture with a different history. I was still horrified and ashamed of my profession. And that blog wasn't even my leadership. I wrote it because a black female superintendent asked my deputy why no one in power had said anything. Not the Prime Minister, not the Commissioner, not her union, and not her boss, by whom she meant me. She didn't feel she had a voice in the Metropolitan Police, a black female superintendent, and I was ashamed of that. I had a responsibility to speak for her, and I wasn't brave enough to do it as a constable. I wouldn't have reached the top if I had, so I had to do it now. And to be a police officer of colour in May 2020 tested my vocation in a way I hadn't felt since the Macpherson inquiry in 1999. And it was really hard to be a cop then when you were black or white. But the harsh medicine of Macpherson was necessary. It changed UK policing and society dramatically. And there's me hoping and thinking, what would this new watershed moment do? Because many say policing is still institutionally racist and corrupt. And it certainly was. But until 2020, my answer would have been, we could no longer be labelled like that. But I was wrong. Floyd told me that. And in 2023, Baroness Louise Casey's report proved it. Policing also still has overtly racist, corrupt officers and staff. They are far fewer than the media would have you believe, but they are far more than police leaders realise. And my professional experience is that 1 in 5 people are either lazy, incompetent, corrupt, or prejudiced, and sometimes they're just all 4. Now, motivating and retraining the lazy and incompetent is leadership, but so is firing the prejudiced and corrupt. A lot of my friends that I met before I became a police officer are now very, very well paid chief execs and chairmen of businesses. And when I read that line to them, they laughed and said, why don't you just fire the people who are lazy and incompetent? That's a waste of leadership effort. So in showing you some difference between the private sector and the public sector, I happen to think you should try and give people a second chance. But I don't think you should give them a second chance for corruption or prejudice. And that is a value and a responsibility that too many police leaders fail to grasp. And policing also has systems and processes that still have disproportionate outcomes. And of course, that was part of Macpherson's institutionally racist definition. It's very hard for policing to say it's not institutionally racist when the evidence by its own data says that it is. And if policing keeps examining and contesting that data to try and disprove disproportionality, then it's got a real problem. If they agree it's disproportionate, but they think that the disproportionality is acceptable, these are all things I've heard from various chief constables, that it's not caused by discrimination, then I'd like to hear their reasoning out loud in public. I've yet to hear it out loud in public. Some chiefs are trying to fix these outcomes. They do show signs of wanting to be what I call institutionally anti-racist. Not many of them, but a few are. They are acting, but it does start by admitting what you are, apologising for it, and only then committing to a plan for change. And only 5 out of 52 chiefs have ever admitted that since 1999. 2 of us are retired. Without that admission, communities don't believe police want to change, even if chiefs take the right action. And that means they probably don't want to help with that action either. And it was all getting much, much better. If anyone reads the British Attitude Survey, it covers pretty much my formative years until my adulthood. And it is a remarkably optimistic and uplifting document. My mother should be proud she had mixed race children. She was a pioneer. And that attitude survey proves it. It's why I live in this country. But it was all getting better, but there was a reversal. And that reversal was caused, in my view, by Brexit, Trump populism, and the nationalism that released or created at the time. Great, it's back. That is not the long-term trajectory for equality and inclusion, in my view. It can't possibly be. When Obama left the White House, he said if you wanted to be born at any time in human history as a black man or woman, that time would be now. And there were race riots happening outside his window as he said it. I mean, that is hope and optimism for you. And leadership is all about hope and optimism. And I am an optimist on this subject. I have to believe we are better than this, that it will get better because it was getting better, much better. I told you my stories, but my parents' stories were far worse. Stoned in the streets for holding hands in the 1960s. And my children's stories are far better than mine. And that's my optimism. My job now is to make sure that my grandchildren return to that upward trajectory of equality and inclusion. And also, I loved my mission. My parents were public service heroes. They turned the other cheek to abuse and they served 90 years between them, helping to build the National Health Service. They were often caring for people who didn't much care for them. My dad once told me that Gandhi said, "There is no higher calling than to lose yourself in the service of others." That is the essence of public service. It is the heart of servant leadership. It's why I joined and it's why I stayed. It is still my foundation stone as a human being and it was as a police officer. But it's the service to all others that counts, not just the people you like. Part 4. What do we, of course I mean you because I'm happily retired, do now? And for policing, it means that if it really believes that Black Lives Matter and that institutional racism is still a problem, it has to do certain things. And I ask its chiefs to consider a number of things. First, recognise that one of their key responsibilities in staying legitimate and allowing them to enforce the law by consent is the need to be inclusive leaders, both to their colleagues and the public that they serve. Second, give no quarter to extremists left or right who are in the real minority. I should know, it was my profession. No one who supports violence to make a point or who thinks the answer is to censor, deplatform or defund law enforcement, or on the right wants to repatriate British people who look like me. White people should never want me to go back to Stafford, let's be honest. Quite like stuff, I'm happy to go. But they shouldn't get your vote. So to lead, as the law enforcement professionals they are, they have got to speak out and be heard against that kind of hateful extremism. Too many soft voices during the Southport riots, I thought. 56 years as a mixed race man and 30 years as a cop taught me that the majority of human beings want to do the right thing. The law enforcement community charged with keeping order ought to seek to encourage that basic human instinct. And after Macpherson, UK policing was better at racial diversity, equality and inclusion. It definitely changed some officers' hearts and minds, and it definitely changed their behaviour. But that success was a very long time ago. Terrorism and austerity distracted chiefs, and that was leadership failure. In 1999, policing didn't recruit, retain, or promote enough people of colour. And when it did, it disproportionately disadvantaged them when they complained or made a mistake. Police overused stop and search on people of colour and disproportionately used force against them without any explanation of why. And in 2024, policing does exactly the same things. That has to change. Chiefs also argue and have argued with me that every policy and procedure has been reviewed and can now be called anti-racist and non-discriminatory. But the outcomes are exactly the same as 1999. Why? I mean, who's implementing all those so-called anti-racist policies? Could it really be the people, not the policies, intentionally, or probably more likely unconsciously causing that bias? I don't know. But the way policing does business in 2024 is still causing disproportionality in Black communities and doesn't appear to be treating anyone of difference well. What it definitely adds up to is a new low in trust and confidence from people of colour, especially the Afro-Caribbean Black community. Police still can't explain disproportionality in tactics, and therefore it lacks the legitimacy to do the job with that community's consent. And that has to change. And 25 years of post-Macpherson positive action tactics that have been inconsistently applied, if at all, haven't worked. In 2023, Louise Casey proved the Met had lost the confidence of all other protected characteristics too. It's not just institutionally racist, it's institutionally homophobic and misogynist. It's institutionally prejudiced. And I think the problem is that it both attracts and creates and rewards bullies. The disease is bullying. The symptoms are the isms and the phobias. The lust for power over others by disrespecting what we fear or don't understand, from which springs hate. What can it do about this cultural problem? Well, the 6 things I ask of police leaders is firstly, let people talk about it. Listen to people of difference telling you how they feel. Provide support so they can talk in psychological safety. Second, accept that racism and prejudice exists. Educate yourself why. Don't expect the people who are different to teach you. Apologise for the past and say you'll change in the future. Third, tell us from the very top that you want to be anti-racist, anti-prejudiced and institutionally inclusive. Fourth, collect, analyse, publish and explain your workforce and operational diversity statistics. For a public sector organisation, that's actually the law. The fact that most police forces don't do it is disgraceful. And explain. If you think they're fair, say why. I could make a very strong case that stopping young black men killing each other is one of the most anti-racist things policing does. But it's rather pointless without that community support and understanding. Without it, the tactics that are used will always be condemned as racist. Fifth, use a well-resourced, evidence-based positive action plan to provide equality of opportunity. You are not trying to make everyone equal. That is, of course, nonsense. You are just trying to give everyone the same fair shot. Then challenge the inevitable backlash when you launch that policy, because you will get one. And if those people won't accept it, ask yourself why and who is at fault. Sixth, put real money and expert resource into this positive action and keep it there. Through austerity, triumph and disaster, because the solution is a generation in the making, not a 4-year political cycle or until your next promotion. And how disgraceful that Chief Constable who disbanded his diversity unit the year I retired. These 6 things are just a start of inclusive leadership in an anti-racist profession. Now, forgive me, we're nearly there. You've been very patient. But part 5 is how I made it. And the reason I introduced part 5 into the speech, because normally you'd be going home, is because no one ever asked me this question, which I always thought was very strange. I do this when I mentor lots of young black, female, and Asian officers, combinations of all 3 things of protected characteristics. No one says, how did you make it? Well, did I think we can all agree that I almost made it. Thank you, Joshua, assistant. The short story is quite simple. I am a person of immense privilege. I was born a man into a middle-class family with wonderful, successful parents, siblings, and friends. I believed in education, and I was very well educated at state expense. I believed in teams and teamwork because I played team sport well. And I learned if I worked hard, I couldn't be intimidated physically or intellectually. But lastly, I was culturally raised to play the white man's game in a white man's world. I learned to play what I call the FIFO game. I learned to fit in to avoid being told to fuck off. And that last sentence was incredibly hard to write, and I am ashamed of it, not for swearing in front of you, but for turning the other cheek for too long. I had so many advantages. I'm actually a pretty poor advocate for diversity in some respects, because pretty much the only privilege I've never had was white privilege. And that's a line that causes deep anxiety in some people, mostly white privileged people I've noticed. Of course, the poor white working class boys that I grew up with would not describe themselves as privileged, but they hated the police too, so it's a pretty bad comparator for my profession. And in the UK, class, poverty and age can be as revealing to policing as race, gender, sexuality and ableness in terms of how we over-police and underprotect those poor people too. Just look at where the August riots were and how police themselves were targeted by white working class thugs, many of them very young, along with the targeting that they did of black and brown people. But not having white privilege has meant one fact. I've still had to overcome this, that for almost every authority figure I have ever known, I did not look like them. I grew up with very few icons who looked like me, and no one but my father to aspire to, although he was amazing. But he had to be careful about where he chose to live and work, what he said and where he went out with his wife. And I learned to be careful too, about who I talked to, especially white girls, and how I talked to authority. I learned not to be caught out alone on the streets. And as I got older, I was followed by security guards in shops and asked to leave. I was the last one served at the bar and would walk home because white taxi drivers wouldn't stop. Don't think that doesn't happen to me today. The sight of the Union Jack should fill me with pride, particularly at 7:45. You will be out by then for the football fans amongst you. But like the flag of St. George, it actually makes me very anxious. If England aren't playing and there's no royal event, I still avoid pubs and houses that fly those flags. And I'm both a proud Englishman and a royalist. I'm also quite a drinker, as an enormously proud rugby playing old detective. I'm quite certain I'm the only chief constable of the last 10 years to have been regularly stopped and searched as a kid, a teenager, and as an adult, including at every airport I've been through since 9/11, including 2 weeks ago. And that is ironic, as I once used to sign off the rules-based targeting policy and special action. These are a few examples of what being well-off, middle-class, intelligent, well-educated, and physically intimidating did not provide this brown man. And I do want you to note in that list of characteristics, I did not include handsome or impossibly youthful looking. I know you were thinking. Remember my call for humility in leadership. But if you understand these examples and how they made me feel, you might begin to empathize with what it feels like to be different in a majority crowd, organization, and state. And you might just then see people like me differently. You might understand we are really not playing the victim. Life really is this hard. And I played my full part. I'm no longer falsely modest, self-deprecating, or shy, because those qualities didn't command respect when it counted. And I did work hard, like a dog, all of the time. But more important than all of that to my success were 28 very special people. 22 men and shamefully just 6 women who have 3 things in common. They're all white, they all held power over me, and they all helped me when I needed it most. And without their leadership, mentorship, and coaching, I would be nothing. And not all people of colour want white people's help, but they need it. Black people didn't abolish slavery, white people with the power did that. And that is a very controversial statement. It is perhaps more accurate to say that it was black and white people working together that brought that horror to an end. Working together, please remember that. And of all the places in the world whose demographic is majority white, as a person of colour, this Great Britain is where I would want to live. And I've studied and policed the rise of the far right for a decade in the USA throughout Europe. This is the most tolerant country by far. Every survey shows that. But I don't just want tolerance anymore. I want respect. And it isn't over. This is not yet a post-racial society, but it could become one. If you want to know how to make society more equal and you happen to be white, recognizing the advantage of just being white, especially white, male, and straight, is important. As is recognizing that nothing changes unless white people want to help people who don't look, sound, or feel like them. Just like those thousands of anti-racist demonstrators who shamed the thugs of our streets so recently. Friendship, mentorship, and support are the most valuable things you can give, but you have to stand up and say it. Even then, fine words are not enough. The police race action plan was a start. It takes bravery and leadership to write an action plan because you can then be held to account for what you do to deliver it, but you must deliver it. But if you do believe in all of this, but you simply lack the courage to speak up, then remember this quote from Martin Luther King. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And we do remember. So speak up. If you are lucky enough to get a higher and higher platform, then speak even louder. And if I haven't convinced you of the moral case for diversity, inclusion, and equality, think about this. We live in what is described as a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Management consultant have charged you a fortune for that sentence. You're getting this for free. And policing deals with its most wicked problems. What makes policing, or anybody, think they are more likely to solve that type of problem sitting around a table surrounded by people who look the same, were taught the same, have the same opportunities and experiences, and think in exactly the same way? Or is it more likely that the solutions might be found in a more diverse team? A team that doesn't fear you, but respects you and feels psychologically safe to tell truth to power, when that power in the room is you. If policing wants the consent of all the public it serves, it needs all of their help. If it has all of their trust and confidence, the public is more likely to obey the law, give you intelligence, be a willing victim or a cooperative witness in court, and lastly, help that front line when they are getting their heads kicked in instead of filming it and posting it. In the brilliant book by Matthew Syed called Rebel Ideas is a quote I stole because I am a counterterrorism professional to my core, and it is this: we simply must do more to develop the diverse and inclusive leadership that our values require and that our mission demands. Does anyone know who suffered? I've delivered this speech dozens of times. Nobody knows. It's a man called John Brennan. John Brennan was director of the CIA. And he said it because he was describing the bright but white and utterly homogenous US intelligence community. And he was talking about their collective failure to spot the emerging threat of one man in a cave called Osama bin Laden. Now, UK law enforcement is not the CIA, but it does enforce the law in a country that only allows it to police by consent. There are nowhere near enough of them to keep order amongst 70 million people without that consent. And that consent relies on the trust and confidence of all the people they serve, not just the ones that they like. Their continuing legitimacy rests on understanding that diversity and inclusion isn't just a moral or ethical responsibility. It might actually be the only way police get to keep the society safe. And isn't that the mission? It was certainly mine. Thanks for listening. You have been very patient. My name is Neil Basu, and I'm not black or white, but I was definitely blue.